Well, hello from the National Archives Public Programs and Education team. My name is Missy McNatt, and I am an education specialist in Washington, D.C. And welcome to the June National Archives Comes Alive Young Learners Program. You can find information about our future programs on the National Archives website, archives.gov, under Attend an Event, and on the National Archives Facebook page. Today, we meet Thomas Alva Edison, portrayed by Bob Gleason with American Historical Theater. Thomas Edison is perhaps best known for inventing and patenting the incandescent light bulb and the phonograph. But did you know that these two patents were just two of the 1,093 patents that Edison submitted to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office during his lifetime? Thomas Edison had an insatiable curiosity and imagination. And there is a story, I don't know if it's true or not, but a teacher, when he was going to school, threw him out of the class because the teacher claimed he was stupid. And the reason the teacher said this was because Edison asked so many questions. So I'm glad that our education system has changed and that students are now encouraged to ask questions in school. And to our audience, our virtual audience, whether students or adults, I encourage you always to ask questions. In the holdings of the National Archives are numerous records related to Thomas Edison. Most of them are patents. And on this next slide, we see two of those patents. One is for the incandescent light bulb, and the other is for the phonograph. And both of these were patented in 1880, just months apart. Edison was unbelievably busy. On the next slide, we see two more of the patents from Thomas Edison. One is the Kinetoscope, which is like an older movie camera, and the other is the magnetic electric machine that produces electric current. So you can kind of think about that as a generator. So those are just a few. The next slide, we have our Docs Teach activity for today's program. It's docsteach.org, and this activity features the incandescent light bulb. So I encourage you to check it out. Again, that's docsteach.org. We'll share this again at the end of the program. At the end of Thomas Edison's presentation, we will have a question and answer session with him. So please write your questions in the YouTube chat box. We have a National Archives staff member who is monitoring it, and let us know where you're watching from. This program is brought to you by the National Archives Public Programs and Education team and the National Archives Foundation. Now, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to one of the most brilliant minds of his time, Thomas Alva Edison.
Are you ready? Hello?
We're looking forward to this. We're ready.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you just fine.
Then I should start, right?
Yes, please.
All right, this is me starting. Greetings. As you've been told, I'm Thomas Alva Edison, and I am an inventor. And I would like to show you at this time one of my most important and popular inventions, something that people use every day, practically all over the world, and don't even know that I came up with it. So here it is. Hello? That's it. I invented hello. Up to that time, people were saying all sorts of things into the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, usually said, ahoy, ahoy. And other people would say, Smith here, or who's that, or what do you want, or anything. But I said hello, and it caught on, and it's been used ever since. So That's one of my most popular inventions. Now, it is often said of a person that he is a product of his times. I like to think that the times were a product of me. You look around now, and everything you see that you have to turn on, or switch off, or look at, or listen to, and that uses electricity, all got started in my workshop. But none of it would be here at all if it hadn't been for my great-grandfather. He wasn't an inventor. What he was a loyalist. During the Revolution, he supported King George, and they lost. So he had to get out of town. He moved to Canada. Well, that made a deep impression on my father, and he decided that if there was ever a revolution in Canada, he was going to support the rebels. And sure enough, one day there was a revolution in Canada. My father supported the rebels, and they lost. So he had to get out of town. And he moved with his little family to Milan, Ohio, and that's where I was born. See, if my great-grandfather had supported George Washington, we'd all have stayed in New Jersey, and my father never would have met my mother, and I probably never would have been born, and I guess you'd have to watch television by candlelight. But that's the way things worked out. I was born in America, and as you heard, I was sent to school and didn't do very well, and was sent back home again. And my mother taught me. She had been a school teacher as well. So I grew up sort of my own mind. I could do pretty much whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. And one of the things I did was burn down the barn when I was experimenting with fire and chemicals. And that was very upsetting to my father, who insisted that I stop that. He let me do my experiments in the basement if I promised not to burn down the house. Well, I was what you call an enterprising young man. I wanted to make money and be able to support myself, so I got myself a job selling newspapers on the railroad train that went from Port Huron, where we moved, to Detroit. I would sell the papers on the way to Detroit. In Detroit, I would buy fruits and vegetables and sell them on the way back to Port Huron, and then keep the profits, get more papers, and do the same thing back and forth. I did so well that I began to branch out my businesses. I bought a little old printing press and set it up in one of the boxcars of the train and printed my own newspaper and sold it on the train. One day, a fellow from England bought all my papers and took them to London and sold them as the first newspaper ever printed on a moving train. And it was mentioned in the London Times, so that was my first publicity, you might say. Well, I was doing so well in that boxcar with my printing press, I also installed my chemical laboratory at the other end. And one day the train bumped and lurched, and the chemical bench fell over and set fire to the boxcar. And so the conductor threw me, my printing press, and my chemical laboratory out of the train. And that was the end of my entrepreneurship on the railroad. What was I going to do next? Well, while I was walking around the railroad yard thinking about what to do, I noticed a little boy sitting on the railroad tracks playing with stones, and one of the cars had come loose and was heading down the tracks right for the little fellow. So I went off running, jumped, grabbed him, and rolled off the track just in time as the car whooshed by, saving the little boy's life. His father, the station manager, saw this from up in the tower where they watched the trains. And he came down and thanked me very much, and then offered as a reward to teach me how to use the telegraph. This was the new big thing. It had been invented 2 years before I was born, and it came along just in time for the railroad. You needed to know when the railroad was going to get where it was going and back again, and all sorts of information that for thousands of years had taken weeks and weeks to get from one place to another. Now, with the telegraph, you could get your information instantly. And if you were an enterprising young man and knew how to work the telegraph, you could work anywhere you wanted. So I left home and I traveled, and I got jobs as a telegraph operator, eventually winding up in Boston, where I volunteered to take the night shift on the telegraph if I could work up in the attic of the office building and continue with my experiments. And one day I knocked over a flagon of acid, which went down through the floorboards onto the boss's desk, set fire to his papers, and that was the end of my chemical laboratory and my job in that building. By then, I'd become fascinated with how things worked, and used to take apart the telegraph equipment and put it back together again and learn how it operated, and decided that I was going to start my own business as an inventor of useful things. The first thing I invented was an electronic vote counter. So I could sell it to Congress and they could count the votes and everything would move a lot faster in government. And I took it to Congress and I showed them how it worked and how fast they could count the votes. And they said, get that thing out of here. We don't want to do things fast. We want to do it slow and methodically and argue about it and make all sorts of deals in the meantime. So we don't want the vote to go quickly. That taught me a very important lesson. Only invent things that you're sure people are going to want. So I looked around to see which was the most busiest business that needed things that I could make. And that turned out to be the stock exchange, where they had to keep track of all the money and all the prices of things all the time, 24 hours a day. And they used what was called a stock ticker, which printed out the numbers that the various stocks were going for. And one day while I was standing there looking at it, it broke down. And they were all in a panic, all the stockbrokers. Who can fix this? Well, I saw what was wrong. A little spring had broken. And I took a little screwdriver out of my pocket and fixed it. And oh, they were beside themselves. They made me the official fixer of stock equipment. And I began to build my own version, which were better and faster. And they were very pleased with my progress. I built one that was so effective, they offered to buy the whole thing from me, including the patent. And I wondered, well, how much should I charge for this? Maybe I'll ask for $1,000. And I couldn't make up my mind to be so bold as to ask for that much money. So I said, well, make me an offer. And they offered me $40,000. And I took it. And with that, we started our own laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey. So there I was, back in New Jersey again. If my great-grandfather had stayed the course and supported George Washington, I might have been in New Jersey all along, or might not have been anywhere if my father had never gone to Canada and met my mother. But that's for another kind of science. So there I was with my own little town, practically, Menlo Park. It had a railroad, it had the telegraph. We built the first scientific experimenting laboratory and filled it full of everything we thought we might need to make anything that might be useful and people would want to buy. So the first thing we did was improve the telegraph. It turns out that the telegraph was a very useful thing, but it could only send one message at a time and only get one message back at a time. And that was slowing everything down. It was becoming very popular. The telegraph was all over the country and practically all over the world. They had even built an underwater cable under the Atlantic Ocean to carry telegraph messages to Europe, but only one at a time. So Western Union, the telegraph people, were offering a very big reward for anybody who could figure out how to send more than one message at one time through the telegraph. Everybody was working on it. I was working on it. A fellow named Alexander Graham Bell was working on it. But I figured it out. I was able eventually to send 4 messages at a time. And we showed this off at the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876, where they showed off all the inventions that had been invented since the Declaration of Independence. And that was a lot of inventions. Up to the 19th century, 1800, there hadn't been that many really great inventions that changed the world, or that anybody could use. I made a list of them. They invented the boat thousands of years ago, and that was useful. They invented the wheel. They're still using that. They invented the bow, which helped make hunting easier. They invented the compass, so that you could get your boat to where you wanted to go if you knew which way you were going. The printing press, well, that changed a lot of things, helped people learn faster. The telescope was very useful. The lightning rod kept lightning from knocking your chimney down and burning your house. The steam engine, that began to speed things up. They used the steam engine to pump water out of the coal mines in England. Then somebody thought, well, if we put that engine on a big cart, and we put that cart on some wooden rails, we can haul the coal that they're digging up out of the mine down to the river and put it on the barges and send it off. Well, that began the railroad, and the railroad began to change everything. Suddenly you could go anywhere you wanted to go, anytime you wanted to go there, whether the wind was blowing or not. Let's see. After that came the telegraph. The telegraph was the first invention that used electricity to do anything. And that started the whole business. Once people figured out that you could invent a thing like the telegraph, well, who knows what you could invent? So, in this country, they began to invent anything they could think of. Farm machinery, household machinery, business machinery, you name it, they invented it. Typewriters, a better camera, and my improved telegraph. Now, I was in the featured spot at the exposition, and everybody came to see the telegraph. But upstairs, in a little room, Mr. Bell was showing off his telephone, which nobody had thought of up to that time. He was trying to invent the telegraph and accidentally invented the telephone. Hello? So, although my telegraph was very useful and won me the prize, the telephone won the imaginations of the entire country. Suddenly, you didn't have to wait for your message to go down the line on the telegraph and come back. Why, with a telephone, you could actually talk to who you wanted to talk to. And everybody jumped on that bandwagon. You see, once you invent something and it gets out there, every other would-be inventor says, I could have thought of that. I thought of that, but I didn't do anything. I'll try to make it better. And pretty soon, everybody was trying to improve the telephone, which was something I did. And Mr. Bell's telephone wasn't very loud. You had to shout into it, and it didn't carry the messages very far. So I invented a few devices that made the telephone work better, and I patented them. And, well, then we sat down to figure out what the best thing you could do with a telephone might be. The telegraph company wanted a method to record the telegraph messages so that no matter how fast they came in, you'd have a record of them. And so we got to work on that in Menlo Park. And we tried using one of the telephone transmitters to kind of generate a signal that would make scratches on a piece of waxed paper that then we could somehow interpret as words. And while we were doing that, it occurred to us that you could actually make impressions of words on that paper and somehow play them back, as they say now. So we got to work, and my machinist made this. This is the first machine that ever recorded sound. All you had to do was get a cylinder, wrapped tin around it. Then you had a speaking tube, and when on the speaking tube was a little needle that would make impressions on the tin. When you did this, you turn the crank, the drum turned, the needle made the impressions as you spoke. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Then you turned the handle back the other way, back to the beginning of the little lines here with the indentations on them with the sound we hoped, and you played it back. Now, this one is just a model. The real one's in a museum, so it doesn't actually work. But what you would hear when you played it back, as they say, was this. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Well, we couldn't believe our ears. It worked. Now, I'm very suspicious of anything that works the first time. So we kept working at it and experimenting. By George, it worked every time. Well, we announced that in the newspapers, and it was a worldwide sensation. Nobody had ever thought of doing such a thing before. Nobody. All the inventors said, why didn't I think of that? Even Mr. Bell said, I shouldn't have thought of that. It's a very simple thing. And indeed it was. So simple that it went right over people's heads. The only problem was once you played it a couple of times, you wore out the little tin recording, and that was that. So eventually, I figured we'd have to find a way to make it more permanent, and we put it on a shelf and turned our attention to something that was much more important to us at the time. Up to our time, if you wanted to do anything after dark, you had to have candles, or an oil lamp, or a gas lamp. And all of those things were dangerous. If you knocked over the candle or the lamps, or turned off the gas, you would either start a fire or you might suffocate. So there was a great search all over the world for some new device to light up the world without setting fire to it. Now, I cannot say that I invented the light bulb. People had that idea for years. The problem was they couldn't make it last very long. As soon as you lit it up, the little, what they call the filament inside, would burn out, and that was that. So the search was for a bulb that would stay lit long enough to make it practical. And that's where we concentrated our energy. We found out that you had to get all of the air out of the light bulb, so we had to go find a pump that would do that, and we finally did. Then you had to find just the right wire to put inside the light bulb that would glow but not burn up. And that took us quite a long time. I had fellas going all over the world looking for vegetable products and bamboo, all sorts of things, different kinds of wire, platinum, gold, anything that might glow. And finally we found just the right sort of a thing. It was just cotton thread that we'd carbonized, covered or baked so that it turned black and would glow like a piece of charcoal. So we put all that together, and lo and behold, one day we had light. Not only did I perfect the light bulb, but you might say that I invented the idea. But that's beside the point. So we had the light bulb, and it worked, and it lasted. We finally got it to last a couple of 100 hours. That was something that people would buy. But if they're going to buy it, well, you can't just start with a light bulb. You have your light bulb, then you have to have something at this end that you can connect to another thing like this device. There, now you've got your light bulb in a socket. Then you've got to get the electricity to the light bulb. So you had to develop a wiring system. And if it was in your house hanging from the ceiling, you had to get the wires through the walls outside where you connected them to an electric pole. The pole wasn't electric, but the electricity went up on the wires. Then that had to go someplace where they generated the electricity, so you had to not only invent the generator and the generating station. And one thing led to another. It wasn't just the light bulb, it was everything that was connected to the light bulb all the way back to where they were generating the electricity. But we did it. We had to get rich people to support it, but they did, because they could see that everybody was going to want these in their homes. So we made quite a nice profit manufacturing the light bulbs and all the things that were connected to the light bulb, and we couldn't make them fast enough or sell them fast enough. It was an enormous success. And of course, a lot of people said, well, that's very simple, really. I could have done that. So we had a lot of competition, and we had to patent our ideas just as soon as they came along. Like the lady told you, you patent the light bulb and everything connected with it. So while that was going on, Alexander Graham Bell, who had noticed that I improved his telephone, thought that, well, since we weren't doing much of anything with the phonograph, maybe he'd take a crack at it. So his team got together, and they invented, where did I put that thing? That, which was just a cylinder made of wax, and you could make the recording on it, and it would last much longer, and you could play it back anytime you wanted to, and it was quite a success. In fact, such a success that we thought, well, we'd better do something about that if we don't want to get left behind with our own invention. So we took Mr. Bell's idea for the cylinder, and we improved it and patented our improvements. And then eventually we had this. So what we called the phonograph. And it was, well, it was just a combination of our cylinder, the little diaphragm with the needle that played back the sound, and a nice tube trumpet here to amplify the sound. And all you did was, well, you had to wind it up. It was worked by a spring. There was a big spring inside. Wound up and turned the mechanism, and you set it going. And that's what you had. You could have it in your own home and listen to very creaky music, I thought. I wasn't sure it was the best possible way to have your music. After all, why do you want to listen to a tinny sounding thing like that when you can go to a theater or an opera house or a concert hall and hear world-class musicians playing Beethoven and Bach and all those wonderful composers? But apparently people didn't mind. They wanted to have these things in their own homes. So we sold our phonograph, Bell sold his graphophone, and everybody was happy. Then it occurred to me that it's very possible that I could do for pictures what we had done for the spoken word. We had made it possible for people to have the spoken word in their own homes or music. Why shouldn't they have pictures that moved? So we set to work on that. We had to talk to Mr. Eastman out in Rochester, who was making all sorts of, I don't know where it was. Well, he made a portable camera that anybody could use. Before he came along, you had to be like Matthew Brady with a wagon load of equipment and heavy glass plates to take your pictures with, and you had to have money if you wanted to be an amateur photographer. But Mr. Eastman had invented a very simple portable camera and the rolls of film to go with it. And you took your pictures and you sent the whole thing back to Rochester, and they developed your pictures and filled up your camera with more film and sent it back to you, and everybody was happy. But the pictures didn't move. And I thought, well, let's see if we can make them move. So I told my workers, my fellas, I called my muckers, to get show me some designs and some ideas. What they came up with was they had Mr. Eastman take a lot of his film and put it all on one long strip on a spool. And then they invented a device into which you put your film and you turn a crank, and the film would pass in front of a little lens that had a shutter that went up and down, like you blink your eyes real fast. If you blink them fast enough, it seems like the image is standing still. Well, that's what we did. We made the motion picture camera. But you pointed where you wanted after you put your film in it, and you looked through the little range finder, and you turned the crank, and the whole business started moving. And when you had your film developed, you had moving pictures. It was amazing. People were astonished. They couldn't wait to see them. We invented a device called the Nickelodeon that was kind of a tall box with a viewing port in it, and you look in, turn the crank after you put a nickel in the slot, and you could see all sorts of interesting things, dancing and prize fights and scenes of nature and people in parades. Oh, it was very, very popular. My fellas said, you know, Mr. Edison, what we should do is invent a device that will project those pictures on a wall, on a white wall, where dozens and dozens of people can come in and sit down and watch at the same time, not just one fellow dropping a nickel in and turning a crank. Lots of people can see the shows. And I thought, now, who wants to sit in a dark, stuffy room watching these flickering images when they could go to a theater or an opera house and see real-life people doing real-life things? But I was wrong. People loved the idea of going to the flickers, they called them, or the movies, they called them. And so we couldn't manufacture that stuff fast enough for them. Meanwhile, I had an idea that I thought was really going to revolutionize the iron and steel industry. At the time, they couldn't build railroads fast enough all over the country, all over the world. and they were building taller and taller buildings with steel skeletons inside to hold them up. The problem was they were running out of iron ore to make the steel. Most of the mines they had up to that time had wore out, no more iron in them, or if it was too little to risk digging for. And I thought, now there's something I can do. I will invent a system that will extract the iron ore out of the rocks and dirt, and it will be a good use of the leftover mine. I bought an old mine up in Ogdensburg, New Jersey, and I began to build an enormous factory with enormous drums in it that were heavy enough to crush huge boulders into dust. And we'd crush the boulders into dust on the drums, and then we'd take the dust and pour it down a chute, and in the chute were electromagnets that would pull the iron out of the dust, and then we'd melt the iron flakes and into blocks and sell them to the people who were making railroad tracks and girders for big buildings. And just as we got the whole thing going, and it took us nearly 10 years and a couple of $1 million to do this, just as we got it going, somebody out in the Midwest discovered an iron mine so rich that you could practically pick the iron up off the ground. They didn't need our device, our little industry. So I'd spent a couple of $1 million and 10 years building something that nobody wanted. So what do? Give up? No. It occurred to me that in addition to the iron for those buildings, they're going to need an awful lot of cement for the concrete to build the buildings. And not only that, since Mr. Ford had perfected his automobile, they're going to have to start building a lot of roads, and they're going to need concrete for that. So I simply changed the iron ore foundry into a cement making process where you pour the rocks in, grind it up to dust, and do whatever it does to make cement solid. And we sold it to the cement people and made a tidy profit. I even began to design houses made of cement or concrete, depending on which you prefer. And so I managed to, as they say, make lemonade out of the lemons that I was handed. I lost a lot of money on that, but I had an awful lot of fun building it. But not everything is a success the first time. Meanwhile, time was moving on. The Wright brothers invented the airplane. Mr. Ford was building automobiles as fast as he could. And what they needed for the automobiles were batteries, so that they could run the lights and start the car. And I began to spend my time developing better batteries for the automobile industry, and for the railroad used them too. Everybody who needed a battery could get one from us. And to do all this, we had to have a bigger place to work. So we had left Menlo Park and moved to West Orange, New Jersey. And not only did I build a nice big house for my family, I also built a nice big factory for all the things we were making. Our records, our light bulbs, the batteries, anything you could think of that we had patented and were designing and building, we had our factories right there. And it was really great to see everything working so successfully every day until the whole thing burned down. In 1914, for some reason, something caught fire. Now, it shouldn't have been as bad as it was, because we had built our buildings out of the cement that was coming from our cement factory. And I insisted that all our buildings were fireproof. Well, yes, buildings were fireproof, but all of the things inside, the chemicals and the wax for the recordings and all the raw materials we needed were very flammable and went up like the 4th of July. I actually called my family and had them come down to see the fire. I said, you're never going to see a fire this big again. The whole business burned down, except for one building that I think had some of our electronic equipment in it. Well, there I was, 67 years old, and broke, the whole thing gone. Fortunately, I had a friend, Henry Ford, who lent me enough money to get started again, and we did. You don't stop just because you've had a run of bad luck. You just pick yourself up and get going again. We rebuilt our factories and kept on making batteries and wreckers and light bulbs and everything else we needed as long as we could. So, well, that's pretty much the story of my life. I had an idea for something. I'd sit down and work on it until we had a working model that we'd patent it and sell it. exactly what I always wanted to do. I was a happy fellow. Now, it's a terrible death to be talked to death, and you've had to listen to me long enough. I am told that I can take your questions if you have any questions about anything I might have missed. So please feel free to ask. If you're too shy to ask the first question, I can take the second question first.
That's great. Thank you so much. I learned so much. So just a couple of things from our chat box. We have somebody from India watching. So thank you so much for joining us from India. That's amazing.
We've done that without the Telegraph.
Yeah, that's right. Right. I do want to put in a bit of a plug for the National Archives Museum downtown. We have the wax cylinder of President Theodore Roosevelt. I believe he was the first president for whom we have a recording of his voice. So that's in one of the exhibits. I just have to put that plug in quickly. Yeah. So we do have a question, your thoughts about Nikola Tesla. So did you know him, work with him?
Actually, we did. We hired him. He was a brilliant fellow. But he was sort of strange in a way that very, very brilliant people sometimes are. For one thing, he didn't get the jokes. And we were always telling jokes. One day there was a particular kind of electrical generator that wasn't working right, and I was very upset. I said, I'd give $10,000 anybody who could make this thing work right. Well, Mr. Tesla heard that, set to work and fixed it, made it work much better, and then come looking for his $10,000. And I said, Mr. Tesla, you're never going to get along in America until you can understand the way Americans joke about things. He didn't think it was funny. He quit and went to work for Mr. Westinghouse to improve the electrical transmission system throughout the country. As time went by, I realized that one of the big mistakes I made was that I underestimated how valuable Mr. Tesla really was. But he was
Yeah, it's amazing the number of inventors that lived back then. So we're running out of time a little bit, so just a few questions. Did you have a favorite invention, something that you prize?
My favorite invention was our phonograph. I used to tell people it's my baby, and it's going to support me in my old age, and in fact, it did. But it was the only thing I ever really invented that nobody had ever invented before. Most of my other things were developments of ideas people had but couldn't make work. Like Leonardo da Vinci invented the airplane but couldn't make it work because he didn't have a motor. So I improved things, but the phonograph I invented.
Well, that's great. So we are kind of close to being out of time. You talked about some of your invention or something that didn't quite work out for you the way that you had hoped, and how you, as you said, turned lemons into lemonade. But one last question we ask all of our guests, and that is, as Thomas Edison, what advice do you have for young people today?
I took the liberty of making some notes about that. My advice is never give up. Just because something doesn't work the first time, just keep at it. You never know. It took us 10,000 tries to make the light bulb work. And realize that you are capable of amazing things if you put your mind to it, work hard, and don't give up. Do what you love. I never did a day's work in my life. It was all fun for me. I loved it. And there's always another way. If one way doesn't work, try another way. And keep trying until you're satisfied that it either works or it won't. Then go on to the next thing. Use your imagination. All it takes to be an inventor is a good imagination and a pile of junk.
Well, those are great words of wisdom from the Wizard of Menlo Park. Well, thank you so much. And I do want to say, somebody said they're watching from Michigan. So thank you for joining us from Michigan. And exciting to have people from across the country and around the world. So thank you so much, Mr. Edison. We've learned so much from you. And I hope this inspires people to go out and learn more. So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
up the the Docs Teach activity. It does look at Edison's invention for the light bulb. And so I encourage you to check that out, docsteach.org. Lots of other things there too. And then we hope you will join us in July to meet Betsy Ross. And Betsy Ross is going to answer that question for us. Did she, in fact, create that first American flag? So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we hope we'll see you in July. And have a wonderful day and a little bit early, happy Juneteenth, which is the holiday coming up on Monday, and a happy 4th of July. So enjoy both of those upcoming holidays and have a wonderful rest of your day.